Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Lisa Nicole Matthews, 114th President of the National Press Club and Assignment Manager for U.S. Video at the Associated Press. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners Newsmaker with former White House Press Secretary and co-host of Fox News' programs The Five and America's Newsroom, Dana Perino. So good to have you, Dana. We are pleased to welcome Dana back to the National Press Club and look forward to her insights from her new book, Everything Will Be Okay, Life Lessons for Young Women from a Former Young Woman. Before we begin, we want to mention a programming note to our audience. We are happy to accept your questions today and will ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org with Perino in the subject line. So as the COVID-19 pandemic has driven millions of women out of the workforce and created new challenges in the pursuit of work-life balance, the message of former White House Press Secretary Dana Perino's book, Everything Will Be Okay, will be particularly welcome for many. In it, she uses her own experiences to guide young women through their early careers and the personal obstacles they might face as they work to define their lives. And she's had some experiences. Our guest today was just the second woman and the first Republican woman to serve as White House Press Secretary. She took over the role in 2007 from Tony Snow, who passed away the following year from colon cancer at the age of 53. During her time at the podium, speaking for President George W. Bush, she handled tough questions from the press about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and left the office with literal scars, having suffered a black eye during the infamous press conference in Baghdad. For those of you who don't recall that, back in December 14th, 2008, President Bush was taking questions from the media when an angry Iraqi journalist hurled both his shoes at the president. Bush ducked, and Ms. Perino, in the ensuing chaos, took a microphone to the face. Not a pretty picture. But anyway, since then, the slings and arrows have been more of the verbal sort. Ms. Perino has served as a political commentator on Fox News and has written 3 books, one about her time in the White House and the personal toll it took on her, and the second about her dog Jasper, and I really wish Jasper could make an appearance for this one, and her most recent book, which we will discuss today. I've read the book and I can tell you there are lessons to be learned even for the not so young women of this world. So Dana, welcome back and thanks for joining us today.
Lisa, thank you so much. I love the Associated Press. I love the National Press Club. I remember the first time I got to go to the National Press Club, I was like pinching myself because when I was in 3rd grade, my dad started this tradition with me where I had to read the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post every day before he got home from work. And I had to choose 2 articles to discuss before dinner. And he was a voracious news consumer and it kind of planted the seed with me early on. And Washington, D.C. was such a magnificent place when I first arrived. It still is, but when I first arrived, it was like such awe and wonder. And the National Press Club was certainly a part of that. And I would say that I have this new schedule with America's Newsroom. So that's a very early morning start. Right. I am always so grateful that the AP Newswire newsletter that I sign up for, it's the first thing that's in my inbox every day. So I never have to wait around to see when is my newsletter coming.
Awesome.
I utilize it every day. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so the book has been a great project. I just wanted to put all of my mentoring advice into one place. In my first book, I had 1 chapter of mentoring advice. And then over the years, it's just, that's the chapter I would keep hearing about. People would ask, when are you going to write another one? When are you going to? And I realized that young women who I mentor, and I'm quite passionate about mentoring, they're hungry for advice. They kind of want you to give them a plan.
Right.
Like they want to know, what are the 10 things I need to do to be the White House Press Secretary?
Right.
And I always say, well, first you have to be a country music DJ working overnights for minimum wage. And then you will be the White House Press Secretary.
Isn't that the truth?
So the title, Everything Will Be Okay, is for lots of reasons in terms of managing anxieties and things, but really is that in any career advancement that I've had, it wasn't something that I planned. So I just wanted everyone to have like, here's your new guide. It's an updated 2021 guide. And I think it just came out at the right time as working from home has become, living at work. And as you said, Lisa, I'm very concerned about women who have had to leave the workforce because they needed to take care of children. And there has to be a concerted effort across the country to correct that.
Yeah. So this book is different for you, though, just a little bit different. I'm glad you expanded on the mentor part of it. It is such a good book. And although you say life lessons for young women, I'm telling people right now that if you buy this book, even as a woman, an older woman, I found the book to be very helpful myself to kind of reiterate some of those lessons that you need. Have you gotten feedback?
I have. Yeah, it's been actually quite gratifying. I think in some ways, Lisa, for you, like you probably do a lot of these things anyway, and obviously you're a successful person. So you probably have some of your own methods that you could use, but then you become a manager and a leader, and then you're managing younger people. So what do they need to know? And I think in some ways we just assume that young people know how to navigate the workplace, but somebody had to tell me along the way. And now people are so isolated and working from home. Here's a good way. For example, I have this one section called "Don't Wear Uggs in the Workplace."
Yes.
Because it makes you just shuffle around the office. And what sort of energy does that put off? Right. So we're in a competitive world, and everybody is going to be needing to step up their game. So what will differentiate you? Are you punctual? Do you take handwritten notes? Do you set your phone down or not take your phone to a meeting? What is going to make you stand out in a crowd? Do you use your strong voice rather than the up talking that I can't stand, or the vocal fry? All of those things. But then I wanted to take it to the next level, which is how do you become the person in the office that everyone wants to turn to? How do you become that resilient one where they say, oh, let's ask Dana, she can do it. Or Dana will know. Make sure you tell Dana. Don't forget to tell, like, how do you become that person?
So let's talk about some of that. Give us some of that. How, and especially in a Zoom environment, because it's completely different. I mean, you can have your UGG moment in person, but there's some people who are bringing UGG to the Zoom world.
Right.
And they need to know how to like overcome that UGG moment and how to do it in a Zoom world.
So I think I'm actually a little concerned about how people do figure out how to move up. I know they're concerned as well. I think it's going to be incumbent upon managers and company leaders to really think about this because, Lisa, often the most important parts of the meeting happen after the meeting.
Right.
When you're walking out, you're like, hey, that was a good idea. Oh, I have something I'm going to work on. Do you want to meet for coffee tomorrow? And we'll figure it out. Or, hey, let me send you this email. I got this really interesting research paper. It might actually help you with that.
Right.
That kind of stuff's not actually happening right now. So I'm not exactly sure. I did come up with something the other day that I thought was helpful, and it's not in the book. It's just something I came up with when I was asked how to deal with the lack of FaceTime with the boss. Mm-hmm. Even though you might be on a Zoom with a bunch of people, but you don't have that one-on-one time. Like, how do you stay relevant and on the radar screen? So I recommended doing something that I used to do at the White House. I did something every night at the White House called the night note that I sent around, one internally to White House people, but then also to any of the reporters that were going to be working in the morning. So I'd say, okay, here's the thing that's happening tomorrow. The president's going to be doing these two events. When we go to Walter Reed, the pool is going to go. Here's why we chose to go this day. He's doing a swearing. I remember we did a swearing in of new citizens at Walter Reed one time. So you give a little bit of the background, anything to make my day just a little bit easier in the morning the next day, I would send that around. But for the bosses, what I would do is I'd say, here's 3 things that we're working on today. We have 2 challenges. Here's what they are. Here's how we've tried to address them. I could use some guidance from Domestic Policy Council, because tomorrow I know I'm going to get questions about X, Y, or Z. If you have any questions, let me know. And Lisa, it was such an ounce of prevention.
Right.
And everybody felt like they were informed constantly. So I think that communication is really important. So for you at the office, or anybody listening here, or your children, if they're struggling with how to deal with this Zoom management, I recommended once a week, maybe on a Friday, sending an email to your boss or your team that's a little bit like the night note, but would say 3 things from this week that I want to make sure everybody is aware of. Here's how they ended up. Looking forward to next week. I've got 2 things on my mind, just make sure, or on my to-do list. I'll keep you informed as to how that goes. So just a short little touch to make sure you're constantly communicating.
I have to tell you, and this may sound kind of crazy, but you are so freaking normal. Okay. in your book, I mean, seriously, everything about you is just so like real and normal. Will you share with our audience how your movement from calling that phone line to figure out what jobs you were going to try and get, to moving to Washington, D.C., because that was huge for you in the book. I mean, just your life experience.
Right. So I had always wanted to be a reporter. My goal was to be like a local news anchor. There's a saying in mentoring that you have to see her to be her.
Yeah.
Well, when I was a kid and I watched all the news, there were no women that were at the top of the field.
Hey.
And that changes, obviously, as I get into college and graduate school, and cable news comes on the scene, and there's more opportunities, but still, it was pretty male heavy. So I was thinking about local news. Anyway, I was at graduate school in University of Illinois, Springfield, and the internship process that they had there is you had to compete for them. And I was able to win the CBS affiliate, which was kind of the prize. And I loved covering politics, but if I was sent to cover other things like crime, I was a wreck. I was sent to get an interview with a woman whose son had been murdered by her friend, and I couldn't approach her. I circled her like 3 or 4 times. I just did not have the stomach for it. Went back to the newsroom empty-handed, and I called my dad, and my stomach was in knots because my parents, I got a scholarship for college. Mm-hmm. And my parents helped with room and board, but they said that if you're going to graduate school, you're on your own. So I took out a student loan, and I called my dad and I said, I think I just took out a student loan for something I don't want to do. He said, well, after graduation, we'll come back here and you can figure it out. And that kind of unconditional love was very helpful. A lot of us have been the beneficiaries of parents who are like, you're going to be okay. But in my heart, I was like, wow, if I don't take a job in media, I'm never going to get to work in media. Mm-hmm. So I went home. I was waiting tables. It was 1995, making a lot of money waiting tables at Governor's Park Restaurant in Denver. And a job opportunity came up in Washington, D.C. to work as a staff assistant for a Congressman Scott McInnes. And I wrestled with that for a week because I really did think I would never get to work in television again. And that was a real course correction. But I prayed about it. And I talk about this in the book where I learned from Oprah. If you're wrestling with a decision, just before you fall asleep, you put your question into that gap between the pocket when you're awake and then you fall asleep. And the idea is when you wake up, you after that prayer, you should know what you want to do. And I woke up that next morning. I was like, oh, I'm going to Washington. So yeah, I had been calling that number of people. I don't know how many people on here will remember this, maybe some. There was no internet. So how are you going to find jobs around the country in local news? There was a 1-800 number, 1-800 media line.
Right. I remember that line.
Call that number and you listen and you get the code number, like, oh, that job in Idaho Falls. Wait, that sounds good. And then you write down the code.
Right. And
then you punch in the code afterwards. I mean, those were the days, Lisa.
Yeah. Tell me about it. It's so cool. You talk about the inflection point of your career in the White House, because I mean, that was just, it was amazing. I was proud to see you, at the podium. I mean, it's just amazing. It's an amazing job. Talk about, you talked about doing the night notes, but when the job was offered to you, what was going through your mind at the time?
Well, a lot of people might be surprised, especially people that were maybe covering the Bush administration who are listening now. On the day that I was asked to be the White House press secretary, I went into the office to resign. We had 18 months left to go. Josh Bolton, as the chief of staff, had said, if you feel like you won't be able to make it till the end, consider leaving now because the president needs a team around him that can sprint to the finish. And I was talking to my husband, I was like, sprint to the finish, I'm like crawling to the finish. And my health was kind of suffering. Again, stress, not enough sleep, not enough food, all that stuff. So my husband and I had a weekend away. He was in a big race out in Oregon. We flew out there for that. And we had this long, in-depth conversation and make a decision. Like, you know what? Tony Snow's the press secretary. I've been the deputy for 18 months. I'm not going to move up. So maybe it is time for me to move on. So we make this decision, but still I was like dying because nobody really wants to leave the White House. Mm-hmm. So the next day I go in to the White House, and Ed Gillespie is the communications director, counselor to the president. And I see him. I said, "Hi, Ed, can I see you after the communications meeting?" And he says, "Yes, because I need to see you too." I'm like, "Okay, great, thanks." We go to senior staff meeting, we go to communications meeting, and then he dismisses everyone. But he says, "Dana, can you stay?" I said, "Sure." So everybody's filing out, and I'm getting up all of my, I'm getting the guts to say it. And I'm just about to talk when he says, "Do you mind if I go first?" I'm like, "Sure, go ahead." And he says, "The president would like to announce you as a press secretary on Friday." And I said, "That's amazing." Like inside, I was like, "Oh my gosh, my life just changed dramatically." And my second thought was, poor Peter. I was going to have to call and tell him, but when I called him, he was thrilled, and I knew that my life had changed right then if I decided to do a good job. Yeah. But to also then to figure out then what do you do afterwards? Right. Because the job is so interesting. Today is the 40th anniversary of Ronald Reagan being shot. Right. And James Brady, who was the president's press secretary at the time, he took a bullet right above his eyebrow here, and he was paralyzed for the rest of his life. He fought for gun control for a long time. The Brady gun bill that was based on his efforts, and the White House briefing room is named for him. And it's a position that I have loved. I revere it. I protect it as an institution, and I also am really glad to see that the glass ceiling of the White House press secretary's office has been firmly shattered. I would say so. How did you, and nothing about what during the Trump administration, they did not hold as many press conferences and things of that nature when Sarah Huckabee Sanders was at the podium. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that was, and how would you have done things differently had you been in that role? Well, I think that it's hard to compare, right? Because I feel like every press secretary represents their boss well, for what that boss wants, right? So when people ask me, like, why were you so calm and so nice all the time at the podium? I was like, well, one, I think I'm just being myself, but also because that's what he expected in terms of 43. Mm-hmm. And I could look back and think, wow, I could have maybe pushed back a little harder on some things, but you don't get do-overs, and I actually am pretty comfortable with how that ended up for me personally. Sarah Sanders did do a lot of briefings, and then I think that the temperature in the briefing room got to be so hot that it became counterproductive in a way, unfortunately. And also, you did have a situation where you had a president that was more accessible to the press than ever before in lots of different ways. One, the traditional way, in the Oval Office, occasionally in the briefing room, but he would be willing to talk to the press anytime they came in to the Oval Office, or if he was at on the tarmac. He loved the tarmac, right, or right outside of Marine One. So in a way, it's like you were getting direct thinking from him. A press secretary should be able to tell you, what is the president thinking, what's on his mind, and how did he get to that decision? Right. Well, you're getting it right from him. So in some ways, I think the reporter's like, wow, we have all this access. And now I think with Jen Psaki doing regular briefings every single day, like that also works for them very well. Right. How did you find your transition from being a spokesperson for the president to a contributor on Fox News before you not easy. Yeah. Yeah, it was so interesting. So for like 20 years, I had worked as a spokesperson for somebody else. Right. And then all of a sudden they were asking me my opinions about things. And my instincts were always to explain, well, this is what the Bush administration thought. And my colleague, Greg Gutfeld, on one day, they were talking about legalization of marijuana. And I started to say what the book, I was like, well, you know, whatever the policy was at the time, I could come up with it if I really thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg says, no, what do you think? I was like, me? Like, who cares what I think? I've never been elected to anything. Like, I don't know. And so I had to do some thinking. And, you know, it's the number one fear that all of us have all across the world as humans is the fear of public speaking. And why is that, right? It's the fear of ridicule or being criticized or critiqued.
Right.
And so when you finally figure out like, oh, they want to know what I think, I had to do some thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my instincts lined up with what President Bush would have thought anyway, but I did think that was quite interesting. And it took a little time for me to get comfortable with it. And I think when I finally realized that, oh, I actually am going to get to work in television as a career. I'm not going to do PR all the time. I think that was when I finally realized that I could let go and be myself in this job. Just like when I was press secretary, I remember when Tony Snow had his last day, he came into my office and said, how are you doing? I was like, not very good. How am I supposed to fill in for you or take over for you? Like, he's such a giant at the podium. He was so good at the briefings. And he made me stand up and he put his hands on my shoulders and he shook me a little bit. And he said, you are better at this than you think you are. And a couple of weeks later, I was rushing, meeting, had to do the briefing, and I didn't have any notes.
Wow.
And I went to the briefing and I did the briefing, and it was the best one I'd ever done. And I realized, I'm like, oh, this is what Tony meant. Like, I can just be myself, and that would be enough.
Do you think that enough women realize that it's okay to be themselves in today's society? Or, you know, especially in the way that we operate now, you know, whether it's in big business or media or what have you?
Probably not as much as we would like to think so. You know, there's still a lot of questions about, well, why is it that the guys get promoted more quickly than the girls in the office? Like, there's a perception. I think that's changing. You know, a lot of women now, one, they're highly sought after, very well educated, very ambitious and talented, and companies are trying to diversify. So there's a ton of opportunity right now. And yet women, in my experience, and I was a worrier, there's a lot of self-criticism, a lot of negative self-talk, a lot of worry, a lot of wondering, like, what, am I okay? Am I okay? And you never think you're enough of anything.
Right.
Meaning that you're not a good enough wife, good enough sister, good enough friend, good enough colleague, good enough boss, good enough reporter, good enough journalist. They're always like, I'm not enough. What I wanted to do in this book is to say, I'm not going to tell you to stop worrying, because if you tell a woman you worry too much, it just adds to the list of worries and pressures. But what I'm trying to do is say, all right, I know you're going to worry. So how can you take that anxiety and that worry and put it through the catalytic converter and make that energy work for you?
But we were talking about no worries.
Right. So I feel like it bothers me, and I wasn't sure it bothered anybody else. And I almost took this out of the book, but it really bothers me. So my schedule, you know, I'm up at 4:30 a.m. I work until the evening. It's a lot. Like, my days are packed. I'm blessed to have a lot of requests to do events, speeches, come to my event, come to my book party, come to this, come to that. Could you do this podcast? Could you do this interview? Could you do this? And I'm getting better at saying no without explaining why I'm saying no. Just saying, I'm not available, trying that. But when you respond to somebody who's asking for your time and you say, I'm sorry, even I think I'm unavailable at that time. I'm sorry, I'm unavailable at that time. If you write back, no worries, just bugs me. I'm like, you want me to add that worry to my list? Like, now I feel guilty. I can't come to your event. So I almost took it out, but actually I've heard from so many people about that.
Have you?
Yeah.
Okay. Because, you know, that is in my land, I deal with a lot of folks overseas and in London, and no worries is like a phrase for, and I'm sure Peter probably.
My husband's British. Yeah, my husband's British. I'll have to ask him.
Does he use it? He doesn't use no worries? See, what I always say is that it's all good,
Yeah.
because it's always all good.
Or thank you thank you for your consideration. We'd love to have you another time.
Right, right, right. So, how can women in the industry support and lift up other women? I mean, I think it's so important during, it's Women's History Month, and you are like the perfect person to kind of put the bow on the month for us, to discuss how women are doing in the industry.
Well, I think you can do it every day, every single day, all day long. In fact, this morning I just heard from a friend of mine who I worked with in the Bush administration. Her name is Laura Cox Kaplan, and she has a podcast called She Said, She Said. I highly recommend it. And I did an interview about the book on her podcast. And then I have an opportunity on One More Thing on the 5, and I promoted her podcast, and she was blown away. Like, oh, it's so nice. I'm like, wait, you helped me.
Yeah.
Like, we can help each other. Like, it's not that hard. And I also think that aside from not being able to promote things, in the office if someone's having a bad day.
Right.
Or if somebody got their head bitten off for something they didn't cause. Or maybe the presentation bombed, or maybe the Zoom went out right in the middle of their speech. Reach out to those people, lift them up, and compliment them. You pass on compliments. I'm really big about this. If somebody says something nice about someone else, I have a commitment to myself that I will always pass it on. Like, hey, Megan, Charlie was saying you did a great job at that event yesterday. Nice job. Like, passing on little notes of support and encouragement, it can mean a lot. And the other thing is, I think also standing up for other women, right? Looking out for them. This is going to be a small thing, but you asked the question, and I remember being at this dinner in South Carolina with friends, and my friend has a 13-year-old daughter. She's 13 at the time, and she's an only child, a little bit shy, but she's got a little spark. And there's couples there, but it was basically Tracy and me, and then the little girl, and then I think maybe the rest were men. And we're having a nice chat, and then we're talking about some sort of thing, current event thing. And I could tell Macy wanted to say something. So I said, well, Macy, what do you think? So she's trying to articulate herself. She's trying to gather her thoughts, and she's getting the words out, but it was taking her a little bit of time. And Lisa, the guys kept saying, oh, you mean this? Or you mean that?
Yeah.
And interrupting her. And I lost it. I hit the table. I said, stop it. Let her finish.
Right.
She's going to be interrupted by men for the rest of her life.
Right.
So just give her a moment right now so that she can get her words out. And Macy was like, oh, God. Like, Macy, you have the floor. Right? And you have to help the younger women in your office too. Like, don't let them walk around talking like little mouse. Where's your strong voice? You went to that meeting for a reason.
Right.
We have an obligation to help them. And I also think that the success pie, it just keeps getting bigger in life. Because somebody else is successful. Yeah, just because somebody else is successful doesn't mean you won't be.
Right.
If your colleague is successful, maybe then, oh, that's good, because now maybe you could be successful too. Like, I really feel like thinking in abundance when it comes to helping each other is really smart.
You talked about this fantastic minute mentoring program in the book. Talk a little bit about that and how it works and who participates.
Well, so we started it in 2009 or 10. I had gone to it's on the Hill. It's called the Bipartisan Women's Congressional Staff Association.
Okay.
And it's a terrible name, but that's what they were. It was very descriptive of what they were. So it's women from both sides of the aisle. They got together once a month to talk about things, network, and they would have a guest speaker. So one day I got invited, and I tried to give my best thoughts and advice. I think I came up with like my top 10 pieces of advice. And afterwards, I agreed to do a photo line. And when I tell you that 80 women asked if they could have coffee or lunch with me for more personalized advice, I was like, I don't have the time for that, but I felt an obligation to give back to them. So I was lamenting this conundrum with my friend on our walk home. And I said, it would be neat if you could do like mentoring, but in a way like speed dating. So she said, well, why don't we do it? So do you remember Susan Molinari?
Yes, I do.
So, and Dee Martin, who is now at Bracewell, and then Jamie Zweiback is my friend. She's now at Latham and Watkins.
Okay.
They said, let's do it. And Bracewell really came through. And to this day is a sponsor of Minute Mentoring. We don't do as many events as we'd like because it's difficult with our schedules, but we've been utilizing technology more. So I did interviews all summer long during COVID with women where I would like get you on the phone, Lisa, and we would talk about, some of your pieces of advice, and we would take questions from people. What I find is that most women, especially at that younger age, they all have the same questions.
They do.
It's the same thing over and over again. Which is why I'm hoping that this book is very helpful. And I love here. I just heard from a young woman yesterday as I walked by. Her name's Maria. She finished the book and she said, I felt like you were writing it just for me.
Yes.
They all think that. I'm like, that's because you are all having the same problems. And so talk amongst yourselves, help each other.
Right. You also mentioned though that your advice isn't limited to just women. You have a few.
No, I know. I struggled with that because a lot of this advice is obviously gender neutral.
Right.
And I was so buoyed by Trey Gowdy, former congressman who interviewed me for his podcast, and then on his show that he was hosting, he loved the book. He said there was so much in there that he could take away, from the overuse of exclamation points to even like the serenity checklist. And the other thing that was really meaningful to me when I did that interview with him is he put up 2 pictures of young women who used to work for him as his communications directors when he was congressman. And he said, the thing that these 2 have in common is that they were both mentored by you. And I remembered over the years, I had reached out to them because they had asked, and that he remembered that and he knew that. And I realized that this book is sort of helping me show what I'm talking about. Because it all comes around.
Right.
If you help each other. So yeah, and also my husband thinks every man should read it because he thinks then men will then understand that they will never fully understand women. And he finished the draft. He said, wow, you all think a lot.
Right.
You all think much more than we ever think about thinking. And it's true. We do.
But you were very fortunate. You are very fortunate to have a very understanding husband.
Oh, he's great.
And I love the whiteboard idea. Can you talk a little bit, share that with our audience?
Yeah, sure. So I had worked on Capitol Hill and I loved it, but then I met this guy on an airplane and he was from Britain, and I moved to England, got married, and that was 24 years ago. One of my favorite pieces of advice in the book is choosing to be loved is not a career limiting decision.
Right.
And he's a little bit older than me. And when we moved back to the States, we decided to live in San Diego because we could, and we're trying to make a life there, but I was bored and I couldn't see how you could get ahead there. And I really wanted to work for President Bush. So I started thinking about that, but we were trying to set down roots. And again, I'm stuck in this thing of like, if I leave San Diego, I'll never get to come to California again. Like that weird narrow horizon. But he could tell that I really wanted to do it. And I didn't love my job. I was working in a PR firm, and nothing against PR firms, but it just doesn't work for me. And so he did something we call the whiteboard incident. And he sat me down one day and he said, okay, tell me all the things you want to do in a job. What do you like to do in a job? So put it on the board. And then the things you don't like to do in a job. We put that on the board, and then he assigned a numerical value, or somehow we came up with the numerical value. There's a guide in the book to how to do this. And then you add it up. And it's very helpful to making decisions because then it's a little bit more logical and in black and white.
Right. When you see it on the board, it makes a difference, right?
I was like, oh, I really don't want to do this, what I'm doing anymore. And so I came out to Washington, D.C., and I met up with friends, people I had worked with on the Hill before, including Mindy Tucker, who had been, she had worked for Congressman Sam Johnson, and Sam Johnson and Dan Schaefer, who I worked for, were very good friends. So I kept in touch with people through the old fashioned way of postcards. But then I came to Washington. She at that point was working for the Attorney General, John Ashcroft. Stopped by, said hi. I went to Capitol Hill, saw Lauren Maddox, saw a couple other people. I just let people know that if anything comes up, if you think of a job that's like in my wheelhouse, I'd be interested. And 2 weeks later, 9/11 happened.
Right.
And I called Mindy just to say, are you okay? I think it was an email. It was email. Just making sure you're okay. And she called 2 days later on the 13th. And she said, would you still be willing to come to DC after all this? Because I need another spokesperson on my team. And that's what did it. So it was from the whiteboard incident, keeping in touch with your network, and then being available and willing to move. That made all the difference. And then that's why now I actually am working in media and TV, doing exactly what I always wanted to do. I just took this really long route to get here.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I can imagine that there are probably some young people who are listening to this who are thinking, you're Dana Perino, you know people. I don't know anybody. Where do I start? I mean, what kind of advice do you give someone who feels like, well, I'm not popular,
Right.
How do I get to where you are?
Yeah. And also maybe you're an introvert, right? So maybe you don't like to go to parties and things. And actually, I don't love it. One thing I would recommend for anybody listening, a good friend of mine is Adam Grant, and he wrote a book called Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. But he also has a podcast called Work Life. Highly recommend it. And he talks a little bit about then how do you start to build your network? How do you approach somebody and say, I'd like to get to know you, or I'd like to understand a little bit more about how you got to where you are. He has some great sort of opening phrases, introductory ways to communicate. But now we're not going to networking events.
Right.
So now how do you do it? I think clubs like this, the National Press Club, it gives you an opportunity to reach out to 2 people a week. And to say, I just wanted to find out more about your life. If you had 15 minutes, we'd love to get you on the phone. And then you keep in touch with those people. So I used to use postcards. I would choose 5 people a week from my handwritten address book when I lived in England. And I would just send notes all around. Now you can do that with text messages and email and all the Instagram, however else you do it. I also think there is something to be said about networking within your organization right now. So there's a woman here, she wants to learn more about the business. She works in advertising, but she had no idea how the production people did their things. Like, I don't understand how that gets on the screen.
Right.
So I said, oh, well, let me introduce you to this other person, connected them. And now she has a connection in production. And then she said, well, because of that, then she took it upon herself. She reached out to the people in the tech division. And she went there. So now she knows a lot more. She's been doing this for about 3 months. She knows so much more about the business and the company than she ever did before. And she feels stronger in her position in advertising, but also she thinks there might be other opportunities within the organization as she grows. So I think networking within the company during COVID is actually a pretty good idea.
Yeah, there is a silver lining with the pandemic.
A little bit.
I would not be the journalist I am if I didn't ask you a few political questions.
Okay.
So talk to me about what you saw on January 6th and how you think it impacted our nation and where we go from there.
Well, I was on air. I was, I at the time was the anchor of the daily briefing with Dana Perino. That was from 2 to 3 p.m. And if you remember, I believe that the first breach of the Capitol was around 1:47 p.m. So I anchored that entire hour. And then I stayed on the air as Bill Hemmer took over. And I went from anchoring to then being somebody who had worked in the Capitol and had my first job was giving tours of the Capitol. So it was actually interesting. Like during the breach, while it was happening, I was able to provide some commentary, like this is where that is. Why does this matter? Obviously, I think it was the most distressing thing. I think I said that at the time. It was distressing and horrific. And I have admired how the prosecutors have gone through very meticulously to arrest anybody who broke the law that day. My heart breaks for the police who lost their lives. There are some who are still injured that are nursing those injuries. And there were some who were just spoken to absolutely abhorrently. So I am hopeful that this investigation will continue. I wish that they could come to an agreement on Capitol Hill to have a commission type thing to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I don't know if that's going to suffice, but I'm looking forward to General Honore's report
Mhm.
I
What
love
about,
General Honore.
yeah, what about the former president's
Mhm.
kind of his view of it? And I mean, he's even gone on Fox News most recently and said that there was a lot of love in the house. There were
Yeah.
kissing and things of that nature. I mean, what kind of message does that send, not just to the nation in general, but to people who even watch your shows?
Well, I would say that one thing I learned, and I talked about in my first book, and a question you asked me earlier, which was, what was it like to go from being a spokesperson for somebody else to being my own spokesperson? The
Hmm.
one thing I learned about that along the way is that I don't have to own the comments of anybody else. I only have to own my comments. And I am cautious in my words. I am strong in my convictions. And so that's how I think about that. Like, I don't own any of that. If you watch America's Newsroom or The Five, the Dana Perino you see right now is the Dana Perino that you get.
That is so good. I love you. Okay, so before I ask the final question, and you guys can move the prompter up for me, let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event. Headliners co-team leaders Donna Linewan and Lori Russo. Today's headliner event coordinator, Danny Selnick. Our club communications director, Lindsay Underwood. And club executive director, Bill McCarran. I'd also like to tell you about some upcoming National Press Club headliners. Tomorrow, NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson will discuss issues of Black representation in the arts and media. And of course, I'm not going to let him off on just that. We're going to talk about more than just the arts and media. On April 1st, we mark the opening of baseball season, Play Ball, with Fred Frommer and Phil Hochsberg, authors of You Gotta Have Heart. So it's going to have a great conversation about opening day and baseball season in general. On April 5th, we welcome Dr. Sudip Parikh. He is the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who will offer his analysis of President Biden's budget requests for science activities. And on the following day, it's really big, April 6th, Dr. Anthony Fauci will discuss the latest developments in the COVID-19 pandemic and the status of the nation's vaccination program. I am very much looking forward to that conversation. And more events are listed at press.org. And we hope you'll join us for those events next week. Before I get even to my final question with you, Dana, coming back to you, have you been vaccinated?
I got my first Pfizer vaccine on Friday.
Congratulations. What do you think about the vaccine hesitancy that we're seeing around the country, and how can we address that?
If I'm hoping that this trend continues, it looks like slowly but surely the hesitancy is abating. And I think part of that is because people have really stepped up. I noticed Juan Williams, who I'm sure has been here as a guest of yours, he's my co-host on The Five. He talked yesterday in his One More Thing about how the Eagles players, Philadelphia Eagles, they did a big vaccine event over the weekend, but specifically trying to help people with autism or parents that have children of autism, because there was concern about how noisy a place might be, for example. And these guys really stepped up. So you have different community leaders that are doing that. I also started to notice, I traveled just to two places for my book tour, one to Dallas and the other to Jacksonville and San Antonio. What I saw was that people where it was required were wearing masks, no problem. If they were outside by themselves in the park, they did it. I'm fine with that too. But a lot of people in Texas that I ran into had been fully vaccinated. So had had their 2 shots and then their 2 weeks. And you could see and feel a little confidence.
Mm-hmm.
I got to see President Bush and Mrs. Bush while I was there. And you know how everybody's like, wait, do I hug you or not hug you? Or can I elbow? What are we doing?
Right.
And when I saw him, he was like, bring it in. I'm vaccinated. So I got to get a hug from the president, and that was great. So I'm hoping over time that starts to get a little bit better. And also when you start realizing, oh, well, if I'm getting vaccinated, and this is a good question for Dr. Fauci when he's on with you guys in a couple of weeks, which is there has to be an additional reason to get vaccinated. It's like are we going to be allowed to then to get back to normal in some way?
Right.
And I think that the health communications on that could be improved a little bit. Now, I do understand, even from when I got my vaccine, the doctor was telling me that they do anticipate some sort of fourth surge here in April.
Right.
We're about 3 to 4 weeks behind Europe, but they don't think that it will result in as many emergency room visits or deaths. Hopefully, we can all do our part on that. So, yeah, I think the vaccine hesitancy, obviously, I know it's a real thing, but even in my own life, I know 2 people who were hesitant who, when Governor Cuomo said that starting tomorrow, they're opening up eligibility to younger ages.
16-year-olds and
He decided, I heard from 2 of them in the last 24 hours that they decided to get an appointment.
That's good. That's good. So in my final question to you, and we're going to let you go so you can get back to doing in the book, you talked about some charity work that you do that you got involved in Africa.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in hearing more about that. Can you share that with our audience?
Sure. So there might even be people here who participated in some of the travels that President Bush and Mrs. Bush did to Africa. For many years, before I had a chance to travel there, as a spokesperson, I would know all of the statistics about how the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, PEPFAR, I knew all the statistics, how much money we'd sent, how many lives we had saved, how many pills had been distributed. And then in February of 2008, we went to 5 countries in 7 days in typical Bush 43 style. It was like, we were on a tear. But my goodness, Lisa, the way that just filled up my heart. And I just was so taken with it. I remember in Liberia meeting President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and I don't get starstruck very easily. She impressed me. And I wasn't speechless, but I did tear up when I got to meet her, just to think of all the things that she had done to go back and to help her country to get through the post-war period. And I get home and I said to Peter, I feel like I need perspective with a capital P. I need to reset my heart after this tumultuous and wonderful and crazy and maddening 8 years in the administration. And so we went to Africa and we had 2 weeks safari and driving through the garden route of South Africa. But then we parked it and we volunteered at a PEPFAR site for 2 weeks. And that was, I think it was very good for our marriage because it gave us a joint central purpose.
In the book, it seemed like it really moved you.
And yeah.
About, holding the children.
Yes, well, that was actually then. So Peter and I continued to support PEPFAR, but also Mercy Ships, which is a surgical hospital ship that works on the west coast of Africa, including Liberia is one of the countries. And that charity is building a brand new hospital ship that will launch later this year, and it will be amazing. But then I also had a chance to be appointed by President Obama to the Broadcasting Board of Governors. And also I was on the One campaign, had a women's advisory board, and they took a group of us to Africa where I met this woman. Her name is Anne Globe, and I write about her in the book because she's a current role model of mine. Like, I admire this woman so much. She's a self-made businesswoman and the most incredible philanthropist, but she gets her hands involved. And I got to go to a place where I held this little boy. I thought he was 2 years old, but he was 7. I had never known any sort of malnutrition like that. And so, yeah, it absolutely bit me and infected me with a desire to always be reaching out. And so the Africa issues are really important to me. My husband and I would try to go to Mercy Ships every March after a general election, a presidential election. This year, obviously, with COVID, that didn't happen. But I'm hoping that by the end of this year, when the new ship is launching, that we can go and really set that one off on a great voyage.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation.
I loved it.
I really, really enjoyed your book. And for anybody who hasn't gotten it, you need to really, it's a great book. It's a great, lots of good advice And it's just fabulous to know that someone else out in the field is normal and is going through the same challenges that
Yes,
everyone else encounters.
yes.
So thanks again, and we appreciate you coming back to the National Press Club. You are welcome anytime.
Thank you.
And Juan is welcome anytime, and we'd love to have you as a member of the National Press Club. So
Thank you so much. Lisa, you're a terrific interviewer, and keep sending that AP Newswire to me in the morning.
absolutely. Have a
Okay.
good one.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.